Hi everyone and welcome on board your really long-haul flight. On this channel we've put together a compilation of some of the most jaw-dropping moments from the sky, so now all that you need to do is find a comfortable place to sit, bring out your favorite drink, sit back and relax.
We'll be able to hold about 5 minutes. That's all we can do.
This aircraft is battering rain and howling winds on its way into New York, which in itself is nothing special. But the pilots on board are flying with a huge knot in their stomachs, because the situation that they are now in is anything but normal. Stay tuned. The airspace around New York City is some of the busiest and most complex in the world. With 3 major international airports within just a few miles from each other and then 35 further smaller airports in the surrounding area, the system has been developed to keep air traffic flowing efficiently and safely into the region, making it essentially the 8th wonder of the world. In fact, this system works so extraordinarily well that hardly anything ever goes wrong, hardly ever. The crew and passengers of Avianca Flight 052 on a wintry day back in 1990 had no idea that they were about to become the exception to that rule. Avianca is the flag carrier of Colombia and the second oldest continuously operating airline in the world after the Dutch KLM. Back in the 1980s and early 1990s, Avianca operated a fleet consisting of 3 Boeing models, with the 747 handling long-haul flights, the 727 for short-haul, and for the mid-range routes they used the by then already antiquated Boeing 707. The 4-engine narrow-body 707 was the first really successful American jetliner when it entered service back in 1958, which I've actually covered over on my second channel, Mentor Now. But while the 707 was revolutionary when it came out, by 1990 it was considered a bit of a dinosaur. Avianca operated the 707-320 Charlie, which was the longest range version with a range of more than 6,000 nautical miles. And this made it ideal for Avianca's 4 times daily direct service from Colombia to New York's John F. Kennedy International Airport. Out of these flights, 3 went from Bogotá and 1 from Medellin, and that one, the one from Medellin, had flight number 052. On the afternoon of the 25th of January 1990, 3 pilots and 6 cabin crew were therefore preparing their 707 for takeoff from Medellin, following a short 1-hour hop from Bogotá. In command of the flight was a 51-year-old captain who had been flying for Avianca since 1962, during which time he had accrued a wide selection of type ratings and 16,787 hours of flying time, including about 1,500 on the 707. The first officer was 28 years old and had a total of 1,837 hours, of which just 64 were on the 707, so there was quite a seniority difference between the two. In fact, the captain had joined Avianca only 3 months after the first officer was born. And then last but not least, the 3rd flight crew member was a 45-year-old flight engineer who was actually the most experienced on the type, with 10,134 total hours, including 3,000 on the 707. Now, none of the flight crew members had any record of any training difficulties, but by modern standards the quality of the training itself back then would have been considered quite antiquated. In 1990, Avianca, for example, did not yet instruct its crews in the principles of CRM, Crew Resource Management, which is the set of strategies that we pilots use to ensure that we're making proper use of every crew member's knowledge, opinions and awareness. On top of that, there were also some issues with the English language proficiency among many of the pilots at Avianca. And apparently the captain of this flight didn't speak enough English to feel comfortable talking to American air traffic controllers, which is something that would soon end up playing a role here. Anyway, back at the aircraft, since this was an en route stop, the pilots wouldn't have needed to review the technical log, since they had already done that when they started their duty back in Bogotá. But they knew from that previous flight that this 22-year-old airplane had a number of potentially significant deferred technical issues. Most significantly, the autopilot was placarded as inoperative, which in itself isn't really a problem. We pilots are perfectly capable of hand-flying the aircraft if needed, but this did mean that the workload during the flight would be higher than normal, especially on a really long flight like this one. In addition to that, the previous flight crew had also reported that the flight directors weren't working properly when used in approach mode. The flight director is an overlay on the primary flight displays that instructs the pilots how to fly in order to achieve a specific desired flight path. For example, when performing a manual instrument approach, the flight director can be set to the approach mode in order to help the pilot follow the glide path and localize the signals from the instrument landing system. Now, with no autopilot and no flight director working in approach mode, an ILS approach would instead have to be flown using what we call raw data. And that means that the pilot has to maintain course and path only with reference to a pair of crude deviation indicators showing roughly the distance between the plane and the glide slope and localizer. Now, flying an ILS approach in raw data is something that we rarely do because it increases the workload a lot, and therefore also the difficulty. Anyway, back in Medellin, the cabin crew helped board the last few passengers, bringing the total number of passengers up to 149, plus the 9 crew members. And whilst the cabin crew were doing that, the flight crew received the dispatch paperwork and the flight plan from the Avianca dispatcher. This flight plan listed Boston as their alternate airport in case they couldn't land at JFK, and it also included a breakdown of the required fuel load for the trip. The requirement used by Avianca stated that the flight had to have enough fuel to taxi to the runway, take off, then fly to its destination, make a missed approach there, then fly to Boston, hold for 30 minutes at 1,500 feet, and then land. All this plus reserve fuel equal to 10% of the total flight time between Medellin and New York. This meant that for the 4-hour and 40-minute flight to New York, a minimum of 6 hours and 8 minutes of fuel was actually required, and that's about 73,930 pounds. And also, to add an extra safety margin, Avianca company policy was to add more fuel above the minimum until the aircraft reached its maximum takeoff weight for the intended takeoff runway. So with the planned takeoff from runway 36 at Medellin, the flight crew were able to uplift a total of 82,000 pounds of fuel, of which 1,500 would be burned during taxi, bringing the aircraft down to its maximum takeoff weight. So as far as the flight crew were concerned, they had taken on quite a lot more fuel than required, so they likely thought that they would be more than ready for any type of contingency that they might encounter. But having said that, they actually had no idea of the true severity of the situation that was now developing over at their destination. You see, on that day, a large low-pressure system was positioned over the entire northeastern United States, generating low overcast, fog, precipitation, and high winds all the way up the eastern seaboard to Canada and inland all the way to Chicago and beyond. With conditions expected to get even worse later in the day, Federal Aviation Administration specialists at the Central Flow Control Facility in Washington, D.C. had begun discussing how to handle the situation early that morning, long before Avianca Flight 052 even departed from Medellin. The Central Flow Control Facility, or Flow Control for short, is the nerve center of America's air traffic network, determining how US airspace is used on a macro level. Flow Control's primary job is to ensure that demand matches capacity at major US airports in real time as conditions fluctuate. Now, during periods of bad weather, the number of airplanes that an airport can accept decreases, since low visibility might prevent some runways from being used, or high winds might force controllers to use increased spacing between all of the aircraft on approach. And this means that the number of flights en route towards that airport also has to decrease, or some of them won't be able to land, and that's where Flow Control steps in. When a major airport's capacity is reduced, Flow Control institutes what's known as a program in order to respond. And one way to do this is by ordering a ground hold for aircraft bound for the affected airport, delaying those aircraft from departing so that the capacity at their destination isn't exceeded. Now, for passengers, these delays can be very frustrating, but it's much better to hold aircraft on the ground than to cause en route delays or even diversions. On the day of this story, Flow Control was aware from an early stage that restrictive programs would probably have to be put in place for the entire New York area, because conditions later in the day were expected to fall below landing minimums at the region's major airports, including JFK. But to understand how this affected the story of Flight 052, we also need to explain how the air traffic control system in the New York area is structured. At the upper levels, the entire United States is subdivided into 22 different sectors, each governed by an Air Route Traffic Control Center, or ARTCC. The New York ARTCC controls traffic over New York City and Long Island, as well as parts of several neighboring states, and it's bordered by the Boston ARTCC to the north and the Washington ARTCC to the south. If an aircraft is headed towards an airport within the New York ARTCC, then midway through its descent it will be handed over to an intermediate control facility known as the TRACON. The TRACON's job is to take aircraft descending out of the upper level airspace and then funnel them into a spider web of designated approach corridors to each of the 38 New York area airports, which at that time included Newark, JFK and LaGuardia. Now, the TRACON also handles aircraft departing from those airports and places them within departure corridors that keeps them away from the approach corridors. Once an aircraft is established on an approach into an airport, the TRACON will then hand over the control to the third and final stage, which is the Air Traffic Control Tower. And for aircraft inbound to JFK, Kennedy Tower will take over from the TRACON only for the last few minutes of each flight, basically just long enough to clear them to land. Anyway, for flow control purposes, the tower supervisors at each major New York airport typically report their estimated capacity to the TRACON flow control specialist, who then coordinates the acceptance rates with the central flow control facility. So for example, if flow control is aware that 40 aircraft bound for JFK are scheduled to arrive during a particular hour, and the tower expects that their acceptance rate during that period would be only 35 aircraft per hour, well then flow control can match demand to capacity by telling, let's say, Chicago to delay takeoff for 5 JFK-bound flights by 1 hour. But US flow control only has the authority to issue ground holds for aircraft departing from the United States, not from aircraft arriving from overseas, which is worth remembering. Now, on the morning when this story took place, the TRACON specialist reported to flow control that the forecasted weather conditions would likely result in an acceptance rate at JFK as low as 28 planes per hour. But flow control wanted an acceptance rate of 32 planes per hour because more than 50 New York-bound flights from Europe had already taken off and would arrive to JFK during the afternoon, and those aircraft would need to land no matter what. What this meant was that if the acceptance rate was too low, well then most domestic flights would have to be held on the ground for long periods while the backlog of international flights was cleared out, and flow control wanted to avoid that if possible. Despite the TRACON specialist's warnings, the central flow control specialist in charge of the New York program therefore decided that the program would assume an acceptance rate at JFK of 33 aircraft per hour. The specialist explained that at a rate of 33 per hour, the average ground delay for JFK-bound domestic flights would be 2 hours and 13 minutes, and that would increase to 3 hours and 10 minutes if the acceptance rate was reduced to 30. 28 was completely off the table. Now, when the TRACON specialist protested this, flow control replied, "Well, you're not going to get that, but I really can't put 3-hour ground delays out." So essentially, what flow control did here was to knowingly release more JFK-bound aircraft than the airport was expected to be able to handle. This with the understanding that some of those flights would have to enter lengthy airborne holds or even divert to alternate airports. Now, this was probably done because 3-hour ground holds would force airlines to start cancelling flights, causing a travel chaos to spread throughout the country. And as we will soon see, this decision would soon have unforeseen consequences. As the day progressed, the weather in New York then got progressively worse, and the controllers therefore, as expected, struggled to achieve the planned acceptance rate of 33 aircraft per hour. By the time Avianca Flight 052 departed Medellin at 15:08, the TRACON specialist had already warned flow control numerous times that the program wasn't working and that airplanes were now entering airborne holds waiting for their turn to land. And then, at 1600, the weather in New York rapidly deteriorated even further. Up until that point, aircraft had been landing on JFK's parallel runways 22 right and 22 left, but now the visibility had fallen below the minimums for 22 right, bringing the airport down to only one usable runway. Now, this sudden deterioration had been predicted by the forecast, but the timing of this turned out to be completely wrong, with the bad weather arriving 4 hours early. So it now became imperative for the Central Flow Control Facility to reduce the planned acceptance rate and issue a widespread ground stop for New York-bound travel. But that unfortunately didn't happen. So as aircraft continued to depart for New York, the airborne traffic jam now worsened, and by 16:30 there were 39 aircraft waiting to land at JFK, while the actual number of landings per hour had fallen down to below 30. By 1800, the New York ARTCC was so full that many aircraft were holding in the neighboring Washington ARTCC as well, and some flights were also forced to divert to alternate airports. And as this was happening, Avianca Flight 052 had taken off and was now heading north straight towards this escalating traffic nightmare, with the pilots on board likely having no idea about it. You see, normally, when bad weather and delays are expected, we pilots are in constant contact with our company or other resources to get the latest information about the air traffic situation, weather, and also to plan for contingencies. We're even sometimes making requests to air traffic control for the latest weather conditions in order to keep our situational awareness up to date. But on Avianca Flight 052, none of that seemed to have happened. And to understand why, we need to talk a little bit more about how this flight had been dispatched to begin with. You see, a major issue here seemed to have been that the pilots of Flight 052 had been given weather forecasts that were already 9 to 10 hours out of date. This meant that the forecast for JFK gave a visibility of 1 mile in rain with overcast at 800 feet and winds gusting up to 30 knots, quite poor but still above minimums. The forecast for their alternate airport, Boston, was even worse, indicating 3/4 of a mile visibility in rain, overcast clouds at 500 feet and winds gusting up to 25 knots. And knowing that, you might already be wondering why Boston was selected as an alternate at all, and that's a really good question. It turns out that the contractor who drafted Avianca's flight plans used a computer system that automatically entered Boston as the alternate airport for every flight to JFK, without actually checking what the weather was like. And Avianca's dispatchers then didn't cross-check if the alternate was appropriate or not. Now, Avianca's own procedures require that the alternate airport should have at least 1,000-foot cloud ceiling and 10 kilometers or 6.2 miles of visibility, which was clearly not met in this case. Now, to be perfectly honest here, the pilots should have caught this when they checked the dispatch paperwork, because making sure that we have a suitable alternate airport is a really important part of our pre-flight duties. But overall, it seems like everyone in this scenario was just going through the motions, so this important question was never even raised. If the pilots would have noticed the poor weather, they could have easily changed the alternate to Buffalo or Syracuse instead, which did meet the weather requirements, but that never happened. Now, on top of this, the pilots could and should have requested updated weather information whilst en route, but for some almost inexplicable reason they didn't do that either. Investigators later reviewed communications with Avianca Dispatch and every air traffic control facility along the flight's route, but there was no record anywhere of any request for the latest weather in JFK made by the flight. Now, we don't know why the crew never performed this crucial part of their duties, but there might have been an element of complacency involved. And that could also explain why the flight crew never asked about the traffic situation in New York either. You see, Avianca had a contract with a dispatch center in Miami that the crew could have called to request this information, but they never did that either. And according to dispatchers who worked there, they rarely heard from any Avianca crew at all. This could suggest that the culture at Avianca was not really encouraging pilots to be very assertive and to take control of their own circumstances, and that is something that we're going to see again as this story continues. Anyway, for several hours, Flight 052 therefore continued uneventfully northward. Eventually, they passed through the Miami, Jacksonville, and finally Washington ARTCC, which is where they suddenly run into the back of the massive queue inbound to JFK. At time 1904, the Washington ARTCC placed Flight 052 into a holding pattern over Norfolk, Virginia, a full 250 nautical miles south of the destination. And that was because not only were all the holding points in the New York ARTCC area already full, but so were the northern holdings in the Washington sector as well. After holding over Norfolk for 19 minutes, Flight 052 was eventually cleared to continue to the Bolton intersection near Atlantic City, New Jersey, where Washington ARTCC put them into a second holding pattern at time 1943 in order to await space to open up in the New York sector. During this period, the pilots were cleared several times to descend, which likely kept up the impression that they were at least making some progress. But at time 20:09, after holding at Atlantic City for 26 minutes, the first officer finally asked Washington for information about any delays into Boston. And this was the first indication that the flight crew was maybe starting to be a little bit concerned about their situation. The cockpit voice recorder unfortunately only captured the last 40 minutes of the flight, so we don't know what the crew were discussing at this point or whether they were actually discussing to divert. But in any case, in response, the Washington controller stated that Boston was open and accepting flights and that they now could expect an additional 30 minutes of holding in New York airspace for JFK. At this point, Flight 052 had already been holding for 45 minutes, which is quite a long time, so 30 more minutes on top of that should have definitely started to raise some alarm bells about their fuel state. Now, of course, things weren't quite the same back in 1990, but the way that we do things today is that we, as a crew, will agree on a minimum diversion fuel level. And if we predict that we will start to get close to that diversion fuel level before we start our approach, then we might decide to divert right away, even before attempting an approach to our destination, especially if the weather is bad. We can also decide to commit to the destination and use our diversion fuel for holding, but only if the weather and situation is so good that a landing is highly likely. Now, calculating the expected fuel levels at any different point, including the diversion fuel required, would nowadays be done using the flight management computer. But on Avianca's 707s, it would instead been the job of the flight engineer to do that. But there is absolutely no evidence that this was being done in this flight at all. Now, if a diversion fuel level isn't established, well, then you run the risk of letting yourself wait too long at your destination, and if the weather then turns out to be terrible, you might find yourself painted into a corner with no way out. At time 2012, Washington ARTCC cleared Flight 052 to continue north into the New York ARTCC, where they were subsequently cleared to the Cameron intersection, 39 miles south of JFK. Cameron was the point where JFK-bound aircraft were normally handed over from the ARTCC to the TRACON. But on that day, because there were more aircraft in the airspace than the airport could handle, aircraft were instead stacked up in holding patterns over Cameron at multiple flight levels. Now, because the TRACON's job is to sequence aircraft for approach, they don't hold aircraft in their airspace. Instead, they only accept a new aircraft when space has opened up in the landing queue. And the TRACON also has to keep a certain distance between aircraft in the approach corridor so that flights don't start catching up with each other when the plane in front starts to slow down for the approach. On this day, there was also a strong wind from the south, which meant that aircraft inbound from the south would have a strong tailwind at first until they turned around to approach runway 22 left, at which point that tailwind would become a headwind, resulting in a huge reduction in ground speed. So because of this, bigger separation was also required in the initial approach corridor, extending the delays even further. This meant that when Avianca Flight 052 finally arrived over Cameron, they were now the last ones in line to be fed into the TRACON. And when you have, let's say, 8 airplanes ahead of you and it takes each of them 5 minutes to cover the separation distance before the next plane can leave the hold, well, then you're looking at a minimum of 40 minutes delay. All of that was apparent to the TRACON controllers, but not so much to the Avianca crew, who seemed to have really had no idea of just how bad these delays actually were. At time 2018, when Flight 052 arrived over Cameron, flying at 14,000 feet, the New York ARTCC told the crew to expect further clearance at time 2030, meaning in about 12 minutes. Now, most likely the flight crew believed that this was the time at which they would finally be cleared for the approach, but that was not what an expect further clearance time actually meant. In fact, the controller had no idea when Flight 052 would be cleared for approach, but they did expect to clear them to descend further at 2030. It's likely that the Avianca crew did not understand this, and later Colombian investigators pointed out that if an expect further clearance or EFC time doesn't refer to the time when the plane will be cleared for approach, then what was the point of that EFC at all? And I kind of agree with that. In fact, that's likely why we don't use EFCs anymore. Instead, controllers today only give us an expected approach time, or if that time is unknown, they will say something like indefinite or undetermined holding. Now, if at this stage the crew of Flight 052 had been told to expect indefinite holding, they might have decided to just divert immediately towards their alternate, or at least to start making some type of contingency plans. But now that didn't happen. And if the pilots would have requested the latest information about the conditions at JFK, they would have learned that the weather was now way worse than expected. In fact, it had a visibility hovering right around their landing minimums, and it was combined with strong winds and rain. In fact, at time 2035, JFK informed flow control that 20% of all flights that attempted to approach runway 22 left had been forced to go around due to low visibility. So this was definitely not the time to commit to that specific airport. But here it seems like the pilots fell into the trap of believing that an approach to JFK was right around the corner, and that once they were cleared for the approach, all of their problems would be solved. As their first EFC time of 2030 approached, the controller provided a new EFC time of 2039, while also clearing the flight to descend down to 11,000 feet. Now, the crew accepted this without a protest, probably figuring that they could still wait 9 minutes more, and besides, they were being given further clearances, so clearly they were making progress, right? Well, time 2039 came and went, with no further clearances issued. It was around this time that the flight crew probably started to become really concerned about their fuel state, when in reality they should have been thinking about this for at least an hour at this point. They had now been holding at 3 different locations for a total of 1 hour and 9 minutes, and that meant that they had used up all of the fuel for the en route portion, plus most of the contingency fuel and diversion fuel that they had on board. In fact, just to land at JFK would now require them to dip into their final reserve fuel, which is never supposed to be used except for in a real emergency. Today, if our calculations show that we're going to have to use any of that reserve fuel, we must immediately declare an emergency to air traffic control using the phrase "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday, fuel." By doing that, we unambiguously tell air traffic control that we need to move every single other aircraft out of our way so that we can land immediately. And there were actually 3 words that could have gotten this response from ATC at the time, and those were emergency, mayday, and also pan pan. At this point, the Avianca crew were within rights to use any of those terms, and if they had, well, then the outcome of the story might have been very different. But instead, the crew now kept waiting past their expected further clearance time until time 2044, when the New York ARTCC transmitted a new EFC time of 21:05. At this point, the pilots must have realized that if they didn't get any further clearances before time 21:05, they might actually run out of fuel even before reaching the airport. So, in response to this new EFC, the first officer now transmitted, well, I think we need priority. Now I want to pause here for a second and discuss the use of this word, priority. You see, priority does confer a sense of urgency, but in general, controllers would assume that if the situation was an actual emergency, well, then the pilots would instead use one of those 3 words that I mentioned before. This meant that if you requested priority, you might receive some favorable treatment, but the controller probably wouldn't drop everything to get you to the runway as fast as physically possible. But Boeing documents related to fuel management on the 707 actually advised the pilots to request priority from air traffic control whenever they were operating with low fuel. And other Avianca pilots testified that their colleagues who had undergone training directly with Boeing, which included the first officer of this flight, came away with the impression that the word priority in a low fuel situation would result in the same air traffic control behavior as the word emergency. Now, this is super important to understand because it actually explains a lot of what happened next here. In response to the first officer's request for priority, the New York ARTCC controller now asked, "How long can you hold and what is your alternate?" The first officer responded, "Yes sir, we're able to hold about 5 minutes. That's all we can do." Now what he meant here was likely that if they didn't start their approach in the next 5 minutes, they would not have enough fuel to reach the runway. But that's not exactly what he said. In response to that, the controller asked, "What's your alternate?" To which the first officer replied, "We said Boston, but it's full of traffic, I think." The controller asked him to repeat that last message, and the first officer then said, "It was Boston, but we can't do it now. We run out of fuel now." As this was happening in the ARTCC facility, a handoff controller, whose job it was to arrange handoffs between the ARTCC and the TRACON, had heard the first officer's request for priority and immediately called to ask the TRACON if they could take Flight 052 in. Now, while his colleague continued speaking with the first officer, the handoff controller said to the TRACON, "Avianca 052, just coming off Cameron, can only do 5 more minutes in the hold. Think you'll be able to take him in, or should I set him up for his alternate?" And in a tragic coincidence, he didn't hear the first officer say that he could no longer reach Boston, since he had already shifted his attention over to calling the TRACON at that point. As a result, the handoff controller assumed that when the first officer said that they could only do 5 more minutes in the hold, he had meant that after 5 minutes they would have to divert to their alternate, when he had actually meant that if they held for more than 5 minutes, they might not even reach JFK. And then, in a second critical miscommunication, the handoff controller didn't advise the TRACON that Flight 052 had requested priority. Because of all of this, the crucial knowledge that Flight 052 could not reach its alternate was now completely lost in the transfer. Less than a minute later, the New York ARTCC cleared Flight 052 to exit the holding pattern and to contact the TRACON, and within moments later they were out of the holding and proceeding in the direction towards JFK. This likely convinced the pilots that they were now being given priority, when in reality they actually weren't. In fact, the TRACON controller had simply decided to take Avianca next, and he didn't think any further special action was actually needed beyond that. And that misunderstanding was also tested just a few minutes later, shortly after the start of the cockpit voice recording. You see, because Flight 052 had been taken out of the holding early, they didn't have the appropriate separation from the aircraft ahead. So at time 2054, the TRACON instructed them to turn right heading 220, I'm gonna have to spin you, sir. And that was, for all practical purposes, another holding pattern. Now, if Flight 052 had declared an emergency, the controller would have obviously ordered other planes out of the way instead of giving them an orbit at this point. So this should have been a clear evidence to the pilots that they were not receiving the type of assistance that they needed. But instead of protesting, they just accepted it without any further questions or calls. Now, it has to be noted here that the captain either couldn't understand the controller's transmissions due to a language barrier, or he wasn't wearing his headset, or something else, because the first officer had to repeat every single instruction back to him. So in this case, the first officer simply gave him the heading that they had been cleared for without explaining what the controller was actually doing or why. And with the autopilot inoperative, the captain would have been hand flying, which probably required the majority of his attention. You see, the autopilot is a workload reducing device, and when you don't have it, the extra workload of flying the plane displaces the ability to direct attention towards other topics, like analyzing the air traffic control and fuel situation, or listening to transmissions in a foreign language. So in this case, the captain simply flew the plane through this orbit as though there was nothing else that he could do about it. Now, that maneuver cost Flight 052 about 6 minutes, which, if you recall, was longer than the pilots said that they could hold for. Now, if the ARTCC had told them to wait for 6 minutes, they might have said no, but now they likely believed that they were being given priority handling, because they must have somehow rationalized that this was the fastest way to get to the runway, even though it obviously wasn't. Anyway, during the orbit, the controller also gave them some more bad news. There was wind shear reported on approach, with a 10-knot change in wind speed at 1500 feet and then again at 500 feet. In the cockpit, the captain now asked, "What is he saying? Wind shear?" To which the first officer replied by repeating the controller's transmission in Spanish. After the controller had told them about the wind shear, the pilots tuned into the automatic terminal information system to copy the latest weather. And that indicated that there was now an indefinite cloud ceiling at 200 feet, visibility of 1/4 of a mile, light drizzle and fog, and winds out of the southwest at 17 knots. So basically, dreadful conditions in which a successful landing was definitely not guaranteed. The pilots were well aware of their dire fuel situation at this point, because the cockpit voice recorder now captured the flight engineer reading out the abnormal procedures for flight with less than 1,000 pounds of fuel in each of the 4 main tanks. You see, when the tanks are nearly empty, changing pitch too sharply can cause the fuel to slosh away from the fuel pump inlets, resulting in engine flameout, so the crew had to be careful here. By now, a mounting sense of dread was probably building up in the pilots' stomachs, and things were about to get much worse. For several minutes, Flight 052 now received normal handling, with progressive clearances to lower and lower altitudes, as well as vectors towards the final approach, just like any other plane in the landing sequence. During this time, the pilots still insisted to themselves that they were indeed being given special accommodation. As the first officer said, "They accommodate us." And the flight engineer stated, "They already know that we're in a bad condition." The first officer also attempted to reassure the captain by adding, "They are giving us priority." But in reality, they weren't. At time 21:11, the TRACON final controller cleared Flight 052 to intercept the ILS approach for runway 22 left and then instructed them to contact the tower. Now, they soon successfully intercepted the localizer to align with the runway and then started preparing to also intercept the glide slope. This would be the hardest part, because with no autopilot and no approach mode on the flight director, the captain would have to, like I mentioned earlier, fly the approach using only raw data instrumentation. With reported wind shear, low visibility, manual flight on raw data and critically low fuel, this was almost certainly the most difficult approach that this captain had ever flown, and it was definitely the one with the highest stakes. Their fuel at this point was so low that if they didn't land on this first attempt, there was almost no chance that they could complete a second approach, so they had to get this approach right. Inside the cockpit, the captain continued having difficulty processing what his colleagues were saying, and at one point he even snapped at the first officer and told him, "Tell me things louder, because I'm not hearing it." And that was a clear sign that he was under extreme stress at this point. At time 21:18, Flight 052 finally began to intercept the glide slope, while the pilots progressively extended the flaps to their maximum setting of 50 degrees and also lowered the landing gear. It would later turn out that flap 50 actually wasn't allowed with the special hush kits that this 707 was equipped with due to noise, and the extra drag from this flap setting likely made the captain's job even harder. Ahead of them, another aircraft now encountered a significant wind shear, worse than what the controller had previously reported, but this information was never passed on. In the cockpit, the captain was trying to follow the glide slope, but he did so with a rate of descent that was too high, likely because of a 60-knot headwind that was causing them to have a lower ground speed than normal. And because of this, they now quickly began to descend below the glide slope. The first officer called out corrections, to which the captain ended up overcorrecting, which is very easy to do when you're flying raw data. Remember, he didn't have a flight director telling him how much he should be pitching up or down as he normally would. At time 21:20, Kennedy Tower cleared Avianca Flight 052 to land and reported that the wind was now 090 degrees at 20 knots. So, with that 60-knot headwind that they had at their current altitude, this meant that somewhere in the next few minutes they would experience a 40-knot decrease in wind, in what's known as a negative wind shear. A positive wind shear tends to increase the airspeed and lift the plane up, so a sudden loss of headwind would have the opposite effect, causing airspeed to decrease and the plane to descend instead. Continuing to monitor the instruments as they passed through 1,000 feet, the first officer repeatedly warned, "Slightly below glide slope," and the captain repeatedly responded by overcorrecting above and then back below the glide slope, obviously struggling to follow the raw data indications. "Below glide slope," the first officer cautioned again. "Glide slope!" And then suddenly, at time 21:22, the headwind decreased by 30 or 40 knots in a matter of seconds, causing the airplane to descend rapidly. "This is the wind shear," the first officer exclaimed, accompanied by the ground proximity warning system bursting into life, blaring out, "Glide slope!" "Whoa, up! Think rate!" 500 feet, the first officer then called out. They were now getting very low on the approach. A mile and a half short of the runway, they descended to only 200 feet above a residential neighborhood. The ground proximity warning sounded 13 separate times as the flight crew now desperately looked out, searching for the runway through the rain and fog. But with a cloud ceiling at 200 feet and only a quarter of a mile of visibility, they were unable to spot it. In the cockpit, there was now desperate shouting as the captain exclaimed, "The runway, where is it?" And the first officer repeatedly replying, "I don't see it, I don't see it." And it was at this moment that the captain came to the horrible realization that they wouldn't be able to land. He had no choice but to go around and hope for the best, so he now made the fateful call, "Give me gear up." At this point, Flight 052 only had about 10 minutes of fuel remaining, so even if they had immediately turned straight back to the outer marker and repeated the final approach, it was questionable if they could have made it. But if they wanted any chance of survival, they had to at least try to get that aircraft quickly onto the approach again, but that's not what happened. As the captain started to go around, he told the first officer to request another traffic pattern, while the flight engineer warned him to be smooth with the nose to prevent fuel slushing and engine flameouts. "Executing a missed approach, Avianca 052 Heavy," the first officer reported over the radio, and Candidate Tower responded by instructing them to turn left onto an outbound heading and climb to 2,000 feet, which was the ILS intercept altitude. Hearing this transmission, the captain started to say, "We don't have fuel," but the first officer again simply read back the clearance and didn't protest any further. The captain continued by saying, "I don't know what happened with the runway. I didn't see it," and he then added, "Tell them we are in an emergency." Over the radio, the first officer now told Candidate Tower, "We're running out of fuel," but he still didn't use the word emergency, and the tower controller also didn't ask for how much fuel they actually had left. The captain continued to insist, "Advise him we're in an emergency. Did you tell him?" To which the first officer replied, "Yes, sir, I have already advised him," which is the biggest indicator we have that the first officer believed his request for priority had really conveyed their emergency status to air traffic control. In fact, though, until the first officer said, "We're running out of fuel," neither the TRACON nor the tower controller knew that Flight 052 had any problem with the fuel at all. As the aircraft continued through its outbound turn, the tower instructed them to contact the TRACON for resequencing, which is not at all what would have happened if the controller believed that they were in an actual emergency, by the way. And once again, the first officer simply complied with that request. Moments later, after the crew advised that they had made a missed approach, the TRACON controller instructed them to climb to 3,000 feet in order to get them back into the approach queue. The captain told the first officer to advise him we don't have fuel, but the first officer only acknowledged the instruction to climb whilst also adding, "We're running out of fuel, sir." Climbing to 3,000 feet would simply waste their fuel and throw away whatever slim chance that they still had, but yet the captain complied and they started climbing anyway. The controller now also said, "Avianca 052 Heavy, I'm going to bring you about 15 miles northeast and then turn you back into the approach. Is that fine with you and your fuel?" And before replying, the flight engineer commented that the controller sounded angry, and the first officer therefore meekly replied, "I guess so, thank you very much." And then, for a while after this, there was only silence in the cockpit. Now, in aviation, we have this concept of 5 hazardous attitudes: anti-authority, impulsivity, invulnerability, macho, and resignation. And that last one, that's the one that I want to talk about here. Resignation is that feeling that there's nothing you can do anyway, so why even bother trying? Which is a real problem, because as a pilot, when you're in a nightmare scenario like this one, continuing to try as hard as you can is really the only thing that you can do. Now, I think that these pilots showed signs of resignation even well before the go-around, already when they started accepting instructions that made their fuel situation progressively worse, and actually even in the planning stage. Pilots need to make sure that they stay in control of events, instead of letting events control them, which is what this crew definitely did here. Just going with the flow and allowing things to happen to them. Sure, the captain was likely task saturated and they didn't have any CRM training, but that still doesn't explain why they stayed so relatively passive throughout this. At time 21:32, with the fuel gauges now reading near zero, Flight 052 began its base turn to intercept the localizer for a second approach. Seconds later, the fuel tanks began to run dry and the engines started shutting down one after another. Amid the sound of engine power rolling back, the flight engineer called out, flame out on engine 4, and then just seconds later he also added, flame out on engine 3, essential on number 2 and number 1. Knowing that the remaining engines would fail at any second, the captain now desperately called out, show me the runway! But they were still 15 miles away from the airport at this point, out over the north shore of Long Island. Over the radio, the first officer now pleaded, we just lost 2 engines and we need priority, please! But, of course, it was now way too late. The controller gave them a final heading to intercept the localizer, and when the crew acknowledged, that was the last thing anyone heard from Avianca Flight 052. On board, the cockpit voice recorder captured the pilots setting up their instruments for the approach, but then the recording abruptly ended as engine 1 and 2 also ran out of fuel and flamed out, removing the last bit of electrical supply from the aircraft. With no engines or electrical power, the lights also went out as the sound of the engines died away and an eerie quiet fell over the doomed 707. Gliding down through the howling wind and rain, there was nothing that the pilots could do except for hoping that they would come down somewhere flat and open. But unfortunately, they didn't. At time 21:34, Avianca Flight 052 slammed nose first into a wooded hillside in the village of Cove Neck on Long Island, causing the fuselage to break into 3 pieces as the entire plane came to a sharp stop. The nose section was catapulted over a hilltop and through a backyard, while the main fuselage came to rest on a nearly 45-degree slope with its tail lying across a residential road. Inside the cabin, the extreme force of the impact caused the seats to buckle and rip out of the floor, sending passengers crashing into their surroundings with devastating results. Among the 158 passengers and crew, the crash ended up killing 73 people, including all 3 pilots and 5 of the 6 cabin crew. And out of the 85 survivors, all except for 2 infants were seriously hurt with multiple broken bones, severe head injuries and many other forms of trauma. But because there was no fuel, there also was no fire. In its final report, the National Transportation Safety Board determined that the cause of the accident was the failure of the flight crew to exercise adequate fuel management and their failure to convey the emergency situation to air traffic control. Contributing factors included the crew's failure to request updated information on the situation in the New York area, improper traffic flow management by the Central Flow Control Facility, and the high difficulty of the manual raw data approach in bad weather under stress. That prevented the crew from landing the plane on that first attempt. In the years that followed, the crash of Avianca Flight 052 became an important cause for safety improvements around the world, affecting several different areas of aviation. In addition to reforming the way that expect further clearances times are issued, air traffic controllers are now much more strongly encouraged to ask a flight crew for more information if they suspect that there might be an issue with the fuel. And the International Civil Aviation Organization established the first unified global testing standards for airmen's English in order to ensure that pilots from around the world could effectively communicate in the language of aviation. This crash and also other crashes during that same time period, including the Kegworth air disaster, also led the FAA to implement new standards for airline seat design to ensure that the seats could withstand an impact of up to 16 Gs and stay in position even in the event of severe damage to the floor. And this accident also endures as a case study for us pilots on how the crew can let themselves fall into a situation from which there is no escape simply by making a series of passive, favorable assumptions about the situation. This tragedy is actually a great example of why we should always plan for contingencies and constantly assess and then reassess our options as we're faced with changing circumstances. And that actually is good advice for any situation in life, including for you guys as well. Imagine that you're in the cockpit of a commercial airliner, accelerating down the runway, when suddenly you realize that another aircraft is heading straight towards you in the opposite direction. Now, this is something that just shouldn't be possible, but yet, here we are. Stay tuned. The 22nd of January 2022 was a nice day in Hayden, Colorado, with only some small whisks of cloud at 500 feet, which were clearing up as the day progressed. The winds were also more or less calm, and because of that, it was turning out to be a good day for recreational flying in the area around Hayden, Yampa Valley Airport. Hayden town lies on the eastern side of the Rocky Mountains, close to several beautiful natural parks, and the closeness to that high peaks in the west means that the airport itself is also situated quite high up, at just over 6,600 feet. This in turn means that the minimum off-route altitude, more out to the east, reaches as high as 16,600 feet, and that's a detail that will soon become important. In any case, Yampa Valley is a relatively small airport and therefore has no dedicated control tower. Instead, it relies on pilots self-reporting their intentions on something known as a Common Traffic Advisory Frequency, or CTAF, where aircraft can also talk directly with each other if they would want to. And on that frequency, there may also be a so-called Unicom operator present who can give weather and traffic information, but that operator has no control function and, as far as I understand, no official procedures to follow either. Now, obviously, for commercial traffic to function properly, there needs to be some kind of interaction with the air traffic control system in order to get route clearances, etc. And in this case, that was done through the Denver Air Route Traffic Control Center, ARTCC, on a separate frequency. So what this all meant was that aircraft that were going to fly out of Hayden Yampa Valley Airport on an instrument flight plan would need to keep the CTAF frequency active on one radio and then the Denver ARTCC on the other. All clearances would come from Denver, but in order to keep track of what was going on in and around the airport itself, accurate communication on the common CTAF frequency was absolutely key. Now, if you think that this sounds a little bit messy, I would tend to agree. For an airport with mostly general aviation, I could see this working reasonably fine, but Yampa Valley wasn't just being used by smaller aircraft. In fact, the mix of operations during the 12th month prior to this day had included 2,100 commercial airliners, 3,955 air taxi flights, and 5,413 general aviation movements. That's 11,468 movements in total, averaging around 30 per day. Among all of these were some seasonal operations by the company JetBlue, and on the 22nd of January they had operated a morning service into Hayden from Fort Lauderdale in Florida. On board that flight were the two pilots who will take center stage in this story, but they hadn't actually been operating that particular flight. Instead, they were both based in Fort Lauderdale and had now been rostered to fly as passengers, something known as deadhead or passive duty, into Hayden, and they were then scheduled to operate as active pilots on the flight back towards Florida. The captain was 45 years old at the time and had worked for JetBlue for about 13 years. He was rated to fly several different types, including the ERJ-170, 190 and the Airbus A320, which was the aircraft that they were now about to operate. His total experience spanned just under 11,600 hours. Very similar to my experience actually, and there was no record of how much of that time that he had spent on the Airbus A320 family specifically. But we do know that he was well rested before the flight and that he had only operated around 44 hours during the preceding 30 days, which is quite civilized. The other pilot scheduled to fly on the return flight to Florida was a 40-year-old first officer. He had been working for JetBlue for about 8 years at the time and had amassed a total flying experience of 3,307 hours, with similar type ratings as the captain had. None of these two pilots had any records of previous accidents or incidents, and their training records were not quoted in the report, meaning that they were likely fine as well. Now, it's very likely that these two pilots used some of the time during their flight into Hayden to prepare for their coming outbound flight, and since the airport was a bit tricky, JetBlue had created a special airport brief for it. Airport briefs are normally issued for airports with unusual operational requirements or threats that the pilots needs to be aware of, and in the case of Hayden Yampa Valley, this was because of very high minimum off-road altitude, MORAS, high terrain, high density altitude, and also, and this is super important here, frequent use of opposing runways, as well as high traffic density and no control tower. The briefing also included instructions around how the pilots needed to make traffic calls and monitor the frequency carefully, and that they needed to call up the airport operations on the Unicom frequency 10 minutes prior to departure. It also highlighted that runway 10 was primarily used for arrivals with tailwinds up to 10 knots, so the pilots in this story were likely well aware of all of these things as they started preparing for the return flight. The flight plan and NOTAMs back towards Fort Lauderdale were straightforward, and the weather was, like I mentioned before, also not really a factor here. It was cold and it had snowed during the night, but as the day was progressing, the weather was clearing up more and more, leaving only some few fleeting clouds at around 500 feet. So, after their arrival into Hayden, the two pilots soon entered the cockpit and started preparing it for the return flight. They had decided that the captain would operate as pilot flying on this leg, so while he started to set up the cockpit for departure, the first officer went out and completed the walk-around. The aircraft that they were going to operate was a beautiful 12-year-old Airbus A320 with no known technical defects recorded in its logbook. And as the pilots continued setting it up, it was also fueled according to the flight plan, which meant that together with the weight of the 102 passengers and 6 crew members, the calculated takeoff weight came to 145,782 pounds, which was 1,800 pounds below the maximum takeoff weight for runway 10. With that weight, the takeoff speeds, V1, the decision speed, VR, rotation speed, and V2, the safe engine out climb speed, came to 142, 142, and 143 knots, and that's worth remembering. Now, at the same time as the JetBlue crew were preparing their Airbus for departure, another aircraft was on its way in towards Hayden Yampa Valley Airport. This was a 28-year-old Beechcraft B300 King Air with the tail number N350 Juliet, flown by a male pilot and his wife, and we don't know much more about his age and experience, but it won't really matter much for what's about to happen anyway. He was flying on an instrument flight plan, and as this story really begins to take shape, he had just started his descent and was coming in towards Hayden from the east, with intention to do an ILS approach for runway 10, the same runway that the JetBlue crew were planning to use for their departure. At around time 11:45 Mountain Standard Time, the boarding of JetBlue flight 1748 had been fully completed, and the cabin crew were closing the doors and preparing for departure with 108 passengers and crew on board. The two pilots were also done with their cockpit preparation and therefore now proceeded with the before engine start checklist. As soon as the doors were closed at time 11:48, the first officer called up the common CTAF frequency and announced that JetBlue flight 1748 were about to start pushing back, and also that they shortly intended to start taxiing out towards runway 10 for departure. Now, there was no reply to this call, but only 5 seconds later, the Beech King Air called up on the same frequency and said,
Hayden Yampa Valley, King Air 350 Juliet. We're about 9 minutes out for a 10 coming in from the east, descending out of 17,000, 350 Juliet.
To this call, the Unicom operator responded and explained that there were multiple inbound aircraft, that the winds were calm and that the altimeter setting was 30.36, and the King Air read this back. In the cockpit of the JetBlue Airbus, the two pilots now discussed that last call, especially the fact that there were multiple inbound aircraft for runway 10. And then the first officer called up Denver Center and advised them that they were still on the ground at Hayden, that they were about to start their engines and would be ready for departure in about 6 to 7 minutes. Denver Center replied and asked if they intended to use runway 10, and when the first officer replied and said that they were, the Denver controller told them to call back when they were at the runway holding point as number 1 for departure and ready to go. That's when they would receive their en route clearance. This was acknowledged by the first officer, and 30 seconds later, the aircraft began its pushback and started up its first engine. As that was happening, the King Air also called up Denver Center, but initially got no response. And at the same time, the pilots in the Airbus had just begun starting up their second engine. When the King Air called up Denver Center a second time, he finally got a response, and the pilot in the King Air asked if it would be possible for him to cancel his instrument flight plan and proceed visually towards runway 28 instead, since he could now see that runway clearly. The Denver controller responded that it was up to the pilot if he wanted to cancel his instrument flight plan, so the King Air pilot confirmed that he would do so and then proceeded under visual rules towards runway 28 instead. The controller acknowledged this and told him that he was free to change frequency. So like I mentioned before, the exchange between Denver Center and the King Air, where the pilot advised that he would cancel his IFR flight plan and instead proceed visually towards the opposite runway, runway 28, took place at the same time as the two Airbus pilots were in the middle of starting up their second engine and performed the after-start checklist. This meant that they, even though they would have maybe heard some radio traffic going on, were likely focused on their own duties and therefore didn't pick up the details of that exchange. Remember, the Denver Center frequency was very busy at the time, with several other calls going on as well, so the likelihood of these pilots giving a call from a random King Air any special attention was very low. But the call that happened next should have been easier to pick up. Because at time 11:53 and 7 seconds, the King Air now called up the Hayden Common CTAF frequency with the following message.
350 Juliet's going to go ahead and land 28, Hayden Yampa Valley. We're straight in 28 right now.
Now this frequency was significantly less busy than the Denver control, so this call should have been heard by the JetBlue pilots. But they were at this point getting ready to taxi, and that includes looking around, making sure that all ground equipment is clear and preparing to navigate on the ground. So it is possible that they were still slightly preoccupied and therefore didn't catch this call either. Another detail that I want to draw your attention to is the fact that the King Air pilot never used the prefix runway in any of his calls. Instead, it was only referred to as 10 or 28, and even though that might sound obvious to everyone sitting at home, correct and detailed phraseology is actually very important, and certain words contain triggers for us pilots. Now, I am aware that I have only operated a very limited amount in US airspace and that the phraseology there tends to differ in intensity quite a bit. But I have noticed in several final reports that radio calls in the US tends to have a more relaxed nature, and that words like runway or sometimes even complete readbacks are sometimes missing. In this case, the clear use of runway 28 might have actually triggered some attention from the JetBlue pilots, something that the phrase "we're straight in 28 now" just didn't do. In any case, 10 seconds after the King Air had called us in on the CTAF frequency, the first officer of flight 1748 also called in and advised that they were coming off the ramp for runway 10. That meant that they were now about to leave the apron and enter the taxiway heading towards the holding point for runway 10. The Unicom operator responded and just advised them that there were multiple aircraft inbound without specifying to which runway. And he then gave them the wind as calm and altimeter setting 30.36, which the first officer also acknowledged. The JetBlue pilots then proceeded with reading through the after-start checklist, and at the very same time, the King Air called up and reported that
350 Juliet's 12 miles, final 28, straight in Hayden Yampa Valley.
Still without using that prefix runway. So again, this call happened as the two JetBlue pilots were busy doing something else, and only a few seconds later, the first officer told the captain that they were number 1 for departure and asked him if he wanted to do something else first. This was likely to see if he should call up Denver Center and report that they were almost ready, but the captain responded that they should probably wait for those inbound planes to come in first. This shows good airmanship on behalf of these two pilots, who at this point were both expecting that all inbound traffic were coming in towards runway 10, the same runway they were planning to use for takeoff, so waiting for them would make perfect sense. Now, Expectation bias is a very powerful psychological phenomenon where a person's expectation of what's going on or what's going to happen will heavily influence what they hear and how they will interpret any information. In this case, both of the JetBlue pilots had at a very early stage formed a mental picture of the traffic flow into the airport, which included multiple inbounds to runway 10. And since there was no controller at the airport, they had then missed the calls from the King Air, which indicated that he had now chosen the opposite runway for landing. Hopefully that explains what happened next, because without this psychological explanation, it doesn't make almost any sense at all. Because now, the two aircraft started talking directly to each other, with the King Air pilot asking on the frequency,
"Anyone about to depart 10 at Hayden?"
and the captain in the Airbus answering,
"JetBlue 1748 is going to hold short of runway 10 at the end of the runway, waiting for our clearance."
The King Air pilot then continued,
"All right, we are on a 10 miles final 28 straight in."
and to that, the captain finally responded,
"All right, copy that. We'll keep an eye out for you."
which the King Air pilot then acknowledged. Now, that's pretty clear, don't you think? Well, keep in mind here that whilst the King Air pilot had clearly said 28, he still wasn't using the prefix runway. And because the two JetBlue pilots were so convinced that he was on final for runway 10, this information just didn't seem to register. Instead, the pilots in the Airbus commented, "All right, so he's coming in now," both expecting to see him turn up on the right-hand side soon. They then started going through the before takeoff checklist where they verbalized the V speeds of 142, 142 and 143, checking that those speeds were properly set in the FMC, on their screens and also in the mode control panel. Once that was done, the first officer took back the radio and called up Denver Control, like he had promised to do, in order to copy the en route clearance. And now, the next piece of this puzzle falls into place. The first officer said,
"Denver, JetBlue 1748, number 1 at runway 10, ready for departure."
The Denver controller responded and asked him to confirm that they were fully ready, which the first officer also did, and the controller then said,
"JetBlue 1748, cleared from Hayden to Fort Lauderdale as filed, climb and maintain 13,000, squawk 0622, release, clearance void if not off in 2 minutes."
Now, whilst the first part of that clearance was a standard en route clearance with routing, altitude and transponder code, the last part was something very specific for an uncontrolled airport. You see, since there was no controller on the airport that could give an actual takeoff clearance, it was up to the pilots to verify the runway to be clear before departure and then to just take off. But in order to be able to verify that this actually happened and to keep some kind of track of it if something had gone wrong, the Denver Controller Center also gave a 2-minute window for the aircraft to take off, something also known as void time. If the aircraft had not taken off by then, well, then they would need to call up to get a new clearance, and if they didn't, the Denver Center could start to investigate why. Pretty clever, but in this case it also came with a pretty significant secondary effect. You see, as the first officer read back this clearance, a new sense of urgency got hold of the two JetBlue pilots. And even though it wouldn't have been a disaster to miss that 2-minute window, they still wanted to avoid that. So they quickly now finished their review of the departure route to follow, and then they completed the before takeoff checklist. Both of them then looked out through the right to see if they could see the traffic that they were expecting on final for runway 10, but they couldn't see anything there, neither out through the window or through the TCAS on their navigation display. So they figured that the inbound traffic must be very slow moving and that they therefore would have plenty of time to take off before it became a problem. Now at this point I should probably explain a few things here. First of all, in the case where there is no air traffic control available, landing traffic always has the right of way in front of traffic that is still on the ground. The Airbus pilots knew this and therefore wanted to get away as soon as possible so they wouldn't be in the way of the landing traffic. Secondly, the TCAS, Traffic Collision and Avoidance System, has quite a few restrictions built into it when the aircraft is still on the ground or at a very low altitude. For For example, all oral advisory messages and warnings are inhibited on the ground. All traffic advisory messages inhibited up to 600 feet, and resolution advisories are inhibited up to 1100 feet. This is to make sure that the pilots aren't fooled into making abrupt maneuvers close to the ground, but TCAS would still show the traffic symbols of any aircraft in its vicinity on the navigational display. So if the pilots would have increased their scale and looked on the other side of the runway, they would have likely spotted the approaching King Air, who was now getting ready to land. But instead, in this case, the two Airbus pilots just continued with their departure procedures, which included sitting the cabin crew down for departure, and when that was done and the aircraft was entering the runway, the first officer sent the following message out over the CTAF frequency.
Hayden traffic, JetBlue 1748 released and we're taking off runway 10.
Now, I'm sure you can imagine the kind of shock and confusion that this must have led to in the cockpit of the King Air. This pilot likely thought that he had been more than clear of where he was and what he was doing, since he had made at least 3 different position reports, including direct communication with the 2 JetBlue pilots. Within 5 seconds, the King Air pilot therefore responded on the CTAF frequency and said,
Hayden Yampa Valley, you got a King Air on final 28. Hayden Yampa Valley, we have been calling.
Now you would think that that call would finally be enough to solve this confusion and get the 2 JetBlue pilots back in the game, but you would sadly be wrong. Instead, in the JetBlue cockpit, the 2 pilots now discussed the position of the calling aircraft, but their expectation bias was so strong that it just did not register that he was actually straight ahead of them. Instead, the first officer called up the CTAF frequency again and said,
Yeah, I thought you guys were still like 8-9 miles out.
Which prompted the King Air pilot to answer,
4 miles.
and then his wife chipping in,
Less than that.
Now obviously, if the 2 JetBlue pilots had understood that they were talking to an aircraft that was landing straight towards them on the other side of the runway, they would have just held their position or even taxied off again. But that didn't happen. Instead, the captain just told his colleague, well, we're taking off now, which prompted the first officer to again radio the CTAF and say,
And JetBlue is on the roll, JetBlue 1748 on the roll, runway 10 Hayden.
And to that, the King Air pilot just chillingly answered,
All right, we're on short final. I hope you don't hit us.
Now, if there ever was a call that should have gotten the JetBlue pilot's attention, it was this one. And that's because, in their mind, they were now speeding up their departure to avoid getting in the way of the aircraft they thought was behind them. But an aircraft behind them wouldn't say, I hope you don't hit us. If anything, they would say, I hope I don't hit you. And another question that we have to ask here is why the King Air, who clearly did understand what was about to happen, didn't just discontinue his approach. Well, if you think about it, that could actually cause an even bigger issue seen from his perspective. A jetliner who's taking off will likely do so around halfway down the runway and then climb very fast. And the King Air, who was on path to touch down on the touchdown zone on the other side, would therefore, at least theoretically, be out of the way of the departing airliner, providing everything went as it should. But if he would choose to go around and start climbing, he would be at a higher altitude further down the runway and could then possibly be even more likely to have a head-on collision with the Airbus. On the other hand, he could have just broken off and proceeded visually for a downwind for runway 10, but this is not something that a pilot should ever have to consider. And I can't even imagine what must have been going through his mind when he heard that JetBlue was now taking off straight towards him. In the Airbus, everything initially proceeded normally, with the captain spooling up the engines and then pushing the thrust lever forward into the full toga detent, and they were using full thrust here likely because of the high pressure altitude of the airport. So the 2 jet engines now roared into life and with full effect started slowly accelerating the aircraft down the runway. The first officer soon called out airspeed alive as the speed tape started moving on his primary flight display, and then only 7 seconds later he said, he's on 28? To which the captain responded, is he? Oh shit. Followed by the first officer making the standard 80 knots, power set call. So what had happened here was that the first officer had done a standard scan of his instrument and had therefore noticed a TCAS target straight ahead in their takeoff direction. This happened before 80 knots was called, so the correct thing for the captain to do would have been to execute a low-speed rejected takeoff and then just taxi off. But that didn't happen. Instead, both pilots now started looking out through their windows to try and identify the aircraft visually, but because they were now trying to see a majority white aircraft towards a background of white snowy mountains and a thin cloud layer, they could see nothing. Meanwhile, their Airbus was accelerating with each passing second, making the decision to reject harder and harder. The JetBlue pilots continued to discuss whether any of them could actually see the traffic, but none of them could. And as that discussion was going on, the King Air pilot again came onto the frequency and asked,
You guys do a quicker turnout in case we're...
and was then stepped on by another transmission, likely from the JetBlue first officer who was responding,
Yes, sir.
Now we don't know for sure, but maybe that last transmission gave the JetBlue captain what he needed in order to make a decision about what course of action to take. Like I mentioned before, a rejected takeoff would have been the most sensible thing to do, and it could have been taken all the way up to V1, as this was clearly a situation of the aircraft being unsafe to fly. But faced with a situation he had likely never seen before, and the associated startle and stress that came with that, it's possible that the captain was now temporarily overwhelmed, and that therefore the mention of an early turn took over in his head. In any case, when that transmission happened, he just responded, "Oh, Jesus Christ," and then he started pulling back on his side stick. Now this happened just as the aircraft passed 118 knots, meaning a full 24 knots before it had reached its calculated rotation speed. And because of that, the first officer now shouted out, "You're slow! Airspeed, 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 airspeed!" But the nose of the aircraft had at this point already started rotating and was now moving into a higher and higher angle. Now the way that the rotation speed is calculated is by using performance data from the aircraft combined with weight, temperature, pressure and a few other things to determine when the aircraft will be able to safely take off and then continue to fly with required margins. If the aircraft is rotated before that speed, there will not be enough air flowing over the wings to effectively carry the aircraft into the air. And that means that unless the rotation is discontinued, the aircraft will just increase the nose angle until eventually its tail will scrape the ground, which will happen at an angle of about 11.7 degrees or so if the main gear is compressed. And that's exactly what now happened. As the aircraft passed between taxiways Alpha 5 and Alpha 4, meaning well before the runway midpoint, a security camera on the ramp recorded the aircraft's struggle to get airborne and its eventual tail strike. In the cockpit, the pilots could feel a strong bump as the tail touched the ground, and it was much more pronounced and violent than they thought that a tail strike would feel like. The aircraft then slowly got airborne, and the captain lowered the nose to allow the speed to start building up. The first officer called out, "Positive rate," and then took the gear up, whilst the captain called out, "What the was that?" And to that, his colleague just responded, "I think it may have been the tail." But now they had other things to think about, because the King Air was just 2.3 nautical miles in front of them, approaching fast. And like I explained before, TCAS would not give them any resolution advisories this close to the ground. So the captain quickly started turning right to avoid the oncoming traffic, whilst the King Air pilot made an unintelligible call on the frequency. The JetBlue first officer responded by saying,
JetBlue's making the turn.
to which the King Air finally responded,
Yep, thank you.
He was now on very short final, and since he could see the Airbus turning away in front of him, he decided to just continue and land. After the aircraft was safely down, the King Air pilot taxied into the apron and then called up Denver Control to ask about the best way to report this incident. He must have been quite upset by the whole ordeal. But this story is still far from over. In the JetBlue cockpit, the pilots now continue their normal procedures by retracting the flaps and completing the after takeoff checklist. At the same time, they were obviously discussing what they had just experienced, and both of them agreed that they had been sure that the other aircraft had been on final for runway 10. The first officer also pointed out that the captain had rotated way too early, to which the captain agreed, and he now said that he would write in the tail strike into the aircraft's logbook once they had landed back in Fort Lauderdale. As this discussion was going on, Denver Control called them up, first without getting an answer, but when he tried again, asking about their flight altitude, the first officer answered,
JetBlue 1748, we're 10,100, climbing to 13,000 off Hayden,
without mentioning a word about what had just happened. The controller responded that he had radar contact with them and that they needed to maintain 13,000 feet because of some traffic, a Hawker maintaining 14,000 feet straight ahead of them. Now, this gave the pilots some further time to discuss what they had just been through, and that included again pointing out how sure they had been about the King Air being on runway 10, but also how they felt that the Unicom operator should have told them that the traffic was actually coming in on runway 28. Obviously that would have been great, but the Unicom operator had no such obligations, and even though he could have done so, the fact that these two pilots were clearly talking to each other and that the King Air had repeatedly pointed out that he was coming in on 28 would have likely been seen as more than enough by that operator. The pilots then also discussed how they thought that the King Air was on an instrument IFR flight plan and how he therefore should have been taken in on runway 10 by the Denver controller. But those points were all moot. These type of discussions are all very typical after a traumatic event where the involved parties tries to find a way to explain and rationalize their own actions. That's all very human, but what that discussion failed to realize was that they now had another very real problem. You see, there is no way for a pilot in the cockpit to assess how badly damaged their aircraft is after a tail strike like this. Yes, the damage could cause issues with the pressurization, which could then lead to warnings, but even if that's not the case, there might still be substantial structural damage that doesn't give any warnings at all. Now here comes today's lesson from the cockpit. Whenever we are faced with a situation where there are many possible outcomes and we have some time available to evaluate it, we pilots are trained to use specific decision-making models to deal with it. Now, this is something that I often talk about in my leadership courses, and these models come with different names in different airlines, like Fordec, for example, but they all say basically the same thing. I use a model called PIOSI, and the way that this model is supposed to be used is by calmly going through the following points. P stands for problem. What is the problem that we are facing? Now, the mistake that most people make on this point is that they misidentify the problem as something that has already happened, rather than what lies ahead of them. A great example of this is where the pilots might think that the tail strike is the problem, when the real problem is actually the issues that this tail strike could pose going forward. If this model would have been used correctly here, the problem would have been possible structural damage to the aircraft, which could lead to further structural issues, pressurization problems, and any number of further failures. Now, when PIOSI is being used, it's always a good idea for the most senior member of the team to ask the question, what do you see as the problem? And then let the most junior team member answer that question. This is because it's possible that this junior crew member could come up with things that the senior hadn't thought about, and he or she will be more likely to state those opinions if asked first, rather than after the more senior members have spoken. So in this case, if the captain would have asked his first officer, he might have responded exactly this: tail strike with possible structural issues, and that would have then brought them to the next step in PIOSI, which is the I for information. This step includes gathering information, which could be done from other crew members, ATC or weather sources, for example, but crucially, it could also come from manuals and emergency checklists. And as it turns out, even though no ECAM warnings or action items were present in this case, there still existed an Airbus QRH checklist for tail strike. That checklist stated 1. Land as soon as possible. 2. Max flight level is 100 or MSA. rate of climb should be targeted to 500 feet per minute, descend to 1000 feet per minute, and approach with normal rate. 3. Notify air traffic control of rate of climb. 4. Ram air on. And 5. Pack 1 and 2 off. Now, this is quite straightforward, and it really shows the crew that this is a serious issue. Hence, land as soon as possible. The rest of the checklist basically tells the crew not to pressurize the aircraft, as the pressure vessel is basically like a balloon, and if that balloon has been weakened by the tail strike, it could pop and then cause even worse damage. With an unpressurized cabin, the climb and descent rate will directly affect the passengers, so higher rates will quickly become very uncomfortable, and that's why the checklists referred to those rates. Anyway, if the information gathering is done correctly, well then the next part of PIOSI becomes much easier. O stands for options. In this case, the QRH checklist said that they needed to land as soon as possible, so options here would have been more about choosing a suitable diversion airport. S stands for select, which means actually selecting one of the options. The first E stands for execute that option, and the second E stands for evaluate. Now, doing a proper evaluation is super important as you go along, since new problems might arise, forcing you to change your plans. So basically, that last E brings you back to the beginning of PIOSI again, like a round clock face. So this is how these decision-making models are supposed to be used, but the pilots in this JetBlue cockpit didn't seem to follow any of these structured models, even though they did still do some of the steps. They started by completing the after takeoff checklist, which would have included verifying the aircraft's pressurization. And when they saw that this was working normally, they seemed to have assumed that the tail strike was no big deal. That in turn then meant that when the Denver controller came back and cleared them to climb to flight level 230, they happily accepted that and started climbing, allowing the pressurization system to slowly increase the differential pressure, pressurizing the balloon. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning of this video, the minimum off-route altitude, MORA in this case, was very high, 16,600 feet where they were flying, so they would have had to climb to that altitude anyway, unless they would get radar vectors lower. But they should not have accepted any higher altitude clearances than that. But that was something that they would only have known if they would have used the Quick Reference Handbook, the QRH, which they didn't do. But the captain did call up the cabin crew to see what they had noticed, and the attendant who answered that call said that they had indeed felt that the tail had hit the runway. She also explained that the impact had been very hard, enough to cause people's belongings to fall from their knees onto the floor, and that several passengers were therefore very worried. Now, hearing that, combined with the hard bump that they had felt themselves, should have definitely led the pilots towards that tail strike checklist, and the fact that it still didn't, in my view, just points towards a lack of training. But it is also obvious that the captain started to get a bit worried here, enough to make him want to contact the company maintenance rep over their company frequency. But not before accepting to climb even higher, up to flight level 260. When the captain started talking to the JetBlue maintenance representative, he explained what had happened and how violent the cabin crew had experienced the event, but he also mentioned that they didn't have any pressurization issues at the moment. The engineer told him to stay on the frequency while he checked if the aircraft had downlogged any of the fault messages that were available, and whilst he was doing that, the first officer checked in with a new Denver controller who cleared them to climb to flight level 310, and then 2 minutes later to flight level 350. Meanwhile, the maintenance engineer got back to the captain and recommended that they should not continue to Fort Lauderdale. The captain agreed, and together they decided that the best thing to do was to divert to Denver instead, since it was relatively close. So at time 12:12 and 13 seconds, the first officer asked Denver Control to initially level off at flight level 310. This was approved, and the captain then called up the cabin crew and informed them about the coming diversion. And he then followed that up with a PA to the passengers, explaining the incident and their need for a tech diversion. Everything was handled really well from this point onwards. The crew then informed the controller that they needed to divert to Denver due to a technical issue, and when asked if they had an emergency, they responded that they didn't, which was perfectly correct in this case since there was no indicated imminent danger. However, if they would have done the QRH checklist at this point, they would have encountered a bit of a conundrum. You see, the tailstrike QRH checklist is not created to be used in an aircraft that is already in cruise at a high altitude. It instead assumes that a tailstrike is sensed immediately and that the checklist is therefore executed before the aircraft climbs above the maximum altitudes of 10,000 feet or MSA, whichever is higher. So what to do in this case then? Well, these pilots never actually took up the checklist, so it wasn't really an issue for them, but what if they had? Now this is an open question to you, but it actually has led to some confusion and issues in the past where pilots have followed the checklist to the letter and therefore ended up depressurizing the aircraft at altitude with an emergency descent as a result. This is actually something that I think that both Airbus and Boeing should improve in their tailstrike checklist since it is far from clear. But my guess is that the most rational thing, if the aircraft is already pressurized and at high altitude, would be to perform a gentle pressurized descent down to below 10,000 feet. The differential pressure, meaning the difference in pressure between the inside and outside of the cabin, would then also gently decrease. And once the aircraft is below 10,000 feet, you could maybe consider depressurizing it then, gently of course, and follow the checklist from that point. But I am not sure what the best procedure from a structural point of view is, so if you're an aircraft structural engineer out there, feel free to let me know what you think in the comment section here below, and while you're down there, remember to subscribe and like the channel. In any case, Flight 1748 soon started descending down towards Denver, and they now also had to explain to the controller what kind of maintenance issue that they had. During the descent, both pilots continued to discuss how this mistake had been possible in the first hand, and in that discussion they actually did mention expectation bias as the most likely culprit. And they also discussed that they could have rejected, which I think was a quite nice touch. You see, we pilots do make mistakes, and the absolutely most important thing, after having solved those mistakes of course, is that we try and learn from them. But in order to do that, we need to be able to first self-critique, because without that there can be no learning, and that's something that I want you out there to take away from all of this. If something you didn't want to happen happened, ask yourself honestly if you could have acted differently, and don't try to just deflect the blame. That will likely lead to the most effective learning experience for you, and that's what I'm hoping for. Anyway, the crew of JetBlue Flight 1748 were eventually told to expect a visual approach into Denver, which they then briefed for. And at time 12:42 and 14 seconds, about 45 minutes after the tailstrike had occurred, the aircraft touched down safely on runway 35 right and then taxied into the apron. The passengers were disembarked and eventually provided with an alternate flight down to Florida, but the aircraft was grounded with substantial damage to its tail section, as you can see here. The National Transportation Safety Board concluded that contributing to the cause of this serious incident was the JetBlue pilot's expectation that the King Air was approaching runway 10, when in reality that was clearly not the case. The King Air pilot's non-standard phraseology, specifically the fact that he didn't say runway in any of his calls, was seen as one of the reasons why the pilots didn't snap out of their faulty mental model. And the captain's early rotation when surprised by the oncoming traffic then directly led to the tailstrike. JetBlue has, since this incident, been working with their instructors to give better guidance on how to safely operate from untowered airports, how to deal with unenunciated failures like tailstrikes, and just general QRH procedures. Now, I have no information about what happened to the two pilots, but I hope that they just received some extra training and were then allowed back to the line again, because that's how just culture should work. People should not be punished for honest mistakes, especially after having accurately reported them. over 1,000 feet below the height of the surrounding terrain, in clouds and with no clue that they're heading straight towards a mountain.
Terrain ahead.
Stay tuned. Have you ever heard the phrase rubbish in, rubbish out? Well, this refers to when you enter something faulty into a computer, which then causes you to get something equally faulty back. And in the world of aviation, with its ever more complicated computer systems, this holds a special significance. Back in 1995, one of the deadliest disasters involving a US carrier took place when the crew of American Airlines Flight 965 failed to spot that they had programmed the wrong waypoint into their flight management computer. This was a single innocuous error, but one that led the aircraft onto a track towards high terrain without the pilots even noticing it. Until it was too late. Now, the aviation industry learned a very hard lesson on that day. So after that, strict confirmations of waypoints and computer inputs have been drilled into all pilots. So that should mean that a similar accident shouldn't be possible today, right? Well, this brings us to today's story, which took place on the 10th of November 2016. This day was supposed to have been a standby duty for the two involved pilots, but late in the afternoon on the 9th of November, the Wizz Air operations controller had called them up and informed them that they would need to operate 4 flights on the following day. The first of those flights was going to be a positioning or ferry flight from Budapest in Hungary over to Nice in Serbia. And these kinds of ferry flights are occasionally required when an aircraft needs to be brought from one airport to another for technical or operational reasons. What it means is that basically the pilots will position the aircraft themselves and sometimes their cabin crew without any passengers, and this can often lead to a more relaxed atmosphere on board. So when the pilots eventually turned up to their crew room in Budapest on the 13th of November, they likely looked forward to this first flight. It's always fun to do something slightly different. Now, neither of them had flown to Nice airport before, so when they started going through the pre-flight material, they probably looked a bit closer at the arrival and approach charts to try to figure out what they could expect, as well as, of course, the overall weather and NOTAMs. But everything looked reasonably straightforward. So when they were happy with the preparation, they just went over to brief their 4 cabin crew colleagues who were likely also looking forward to a very relaxed start of their day. Now, as they all walked out to the aircraft, a shiny Airbus A320-200, the pilots decided that the first officer was going to be pilot flying for this first ferry flight leg, and the captain would therefore be pilot monitoring. But this makes sense to me, as they were flying to a new destination, and when you're a captain, it's always nice to do that as pilot monitoring, because that gives a better overview of the general operation and enables you to spot any potential issues early and then plan for them. Or at least that's the idea. Now, there might of course be situations where the captain have to be pilot flying, especially if the runway is short or there are other operational limitations, but this was not the case here, even though the approach looked a little bit tricky. When they entered the cockpit, the captain first checked the technical status of the aircraft, which was perfectly fine. There was no technical issues open, so he quickly then went outside to start the walk around while the first officer started setting up the cockpit. As he was doing so, one of the flight attendants asked if she could stay in the cockpit for the flight, and the pilot agreed. Or maybe it was the other way around and it was the pilot who asked. We don't really know for sure. But this is not unusual on positioning flights, since it gives the cabin crew an opportunity to both enjoy the views from the flight deck, but also to get a better understanding of the workload that the pilots are facing during different phases of flight, something that is otherwise pretty hidden nowadays behind the locked cockpit door. For us pilots, it's also nice to get a chance to talk to our cabin crew colleagues a bit, something that short-haul pilots rarely get a chance to do nowadays. But it can also create an environment which can become a little bit too relaxed and therefore lead to distractions if it's not managed well. So, who were the pilots of this flight then? Well, the captain was 62 years old and very experienced. He had flown over 22,000 hours in total, with nearly 5,500 on those on the Airbus A320 family. On this day, he said that he felt all right, but that he had not gotten much quality sleep during the previous night, so he also felt a little bit tired. His co-pilot was 49 years old and also relatively experienced, with nearly 5,000 hours of total time and just over 2,000 hours on the Airbus A320 and 321. He had just returned back from some annual leave and had therefore not flown at all during the preceding 10 days. But he was feeling great, and maybe that fact, the fact that he was feeling rested, was another reason for him to fly the first leg. In any case, the pilots continued to set up the aircraft according to their standard procedures. The first officer completed the departure briefing, and after that they would have briefed their cabin crew colleague on how to use the jump seat, headset and oxygen mask, something that we have to do every time that we have someone traveling on the jump seat. After everyone was ready, the first officer asked for pushback and startup clearance, and once that was received, Wizz Air Flight 801 pushed back, started its engines and was soon on its way out towards the runway. Everything was running smoothly as the aircraft continued to taxi out, and they had soon lined up on the runway and received their takeoff clearance. The first officer then set takeoff thrust, the aircraft started accelerating and proceeded for a normal takeoff. They were now on their way towards Nice, climbing like a rocket due to the aircraft's low weight without passengers. Now, before we go any further, it's worth explaining a little bit more about the destination that these pilots were now flying towards. Nice, Constantine the Great Airport, is the second largest airport in Serbia. It's situated in the southern part of the country near the Stara Planina, or Old Mountains, which form part of the western end of the Balkan mountain range, right on the border between Serbia and Bulgaria. And that is one of the biggest threats at Nice, the very high terrain surrounding the airport, as it's actually situated in kind of a valley. While the elevation of the runway is only 650 feet, it is surrounded on nearly all sides by very high terrain, with minimum sector altitude, MSAs, reaching as high as 7,000 feet. The MSAs is altitudes that are highlighted on our navigational charts, and they always gives a minimum terrain clearance of 1,000 feet, and it's one of those things that we pilots have to be constantly aware of. Now, if you're on an instrument flight plan, which all big aircraft are, you can of course descend below the MSA, but only if you're following a pre-approved track or procedure. And the high terrain around this airport meant that accurate track keeping was really important. Because of this, all the arrivals, approach and missed approach procedures into Nice were planned with strict altitude constraints, and that's worth keeping in mind. Another thing that will become really important soon is a system that you might have heard me talking about in some of my other videos, the Enhanced Ground Proximity Warning System, or EGPWS. This system is super clever and likely one of the most safety-enhancing things that have been fitted to aircraft lately. It utilizes a database called WGS84 along with inputs from the Global Positioning System to make sure it always knows exactly where the aircraft is in relation to surrounding terrain, obstacles and man-made structures. It can provide a range of warnings and cautions to crew in order to alert them if, for example, the aircraft comes too close to the ground while having the landing gear in the incorrect position, or if the flap configuration is not correctly set. It can also do the same if the aircraft fails to achieve a positive climb after takeoff, or if its sink rate on approach is too high. In addition to alerts, the EGPWS system can also provide terrain information, which can be selected to overlay the navigation display and show a kind of picture of the terrain around the aircraft. In that setting, it color coordinates terrain to show anything below the aircraft as green, or if it's really far below, black, anything between the same level to 1,000 feet above as low-density yellow blocks, anything above that as high-density yellow, and terrain more than 2,000 feet above as red. Now the pilots must choose between showing either the weather radar or terrain display, since both can't be shown on the same screen simultaneously, and when operating in areas with high terrain, like Nice Airport in this case, it's generally a good idea for one pilot to have terrain displayed and for the other to have the weather radar. Now Airbus uses a Honeywell EGPWS, which contains 6 different modes which are worth knowing about. The first 5 modes provide cautions and warnings for excessive descent rate, excessive terrain closure rate, altitude loss after takeoff or go-around, unsafe terrain clearance when not in landing configuration, and excessive deviation below the glide slope. And the 6th mode just provides advisory callouts like bank angle and minimums. But the one that will become really interesting in this story is mode number 2, excessive terrain closure rate. This mode includes cautions like terrain, which changes to pull up, warnings if the aircraft comes within the warning range. And here comes a difference between the old GPWS, which the crew in the Cali accident had, and the enhanced system, which we're talking about here. You see, in the enhanced system, it doesn't just react to terrain. It can also look ahead, effectively predicting a conflict and therefore providing a much greater alerting time. It does this by projecting ribbons ahead of the aircraft, which shows where the aircraft will be during the coming minutes with its current trajectory and speed. It then compares this progress prediction with its terrain database, and if that prediction shows that the ribbons will risk running into terrain, well, then it starts issuing an alert. The caution alert typically sounds when the aircraft is predicted to be around 40 to 60 seconds away from impact, and the pull up warning then sounds approximately 30 seconds before. 30 seconds is still not a lot of time, but because it's based on a forward-looking predictive function, it should be enough if the correct responses are followed. Now, once the aircraft had reached its cruising altitude, the crew relaxed a bit. They then completed their paperwork, and it's fair to assume that the atmosphere on board was quite relaxed and pleasant at this point, possibly with the cockpit door open and with more cabin crew coming in and visiting. But as the aircraft eventually started approaching the top of descent, the crew started to concentrate and prepare for the arrival with the expected terrain threats fresh in their minds. It was particularly important to do a thorough brief here, since neither of the pilots had ever operated into this airport before. Now, without experience of the airport and what clearances air traffic control might give them, the crew decided to set up the arrival and approach suggested on their flight plan, the SOSEC 1 Romeo Alpha arrival. And after having checked the weather, they also saw that runway 11 was in use with a VOR approach. Now, the Airbus A320 has an FMC, a flight management computer, in which the crew can program the route and also things like the expected arrival and approach procedure. So the crew here just selected the SOSEC 1 Romeo Alpha arrival and then added the VOR 11 approach from the approach drop-down menu. The FMC also gives an option of selecting a transition or via point. And for the SOSEC 1 Romeo Alpha, the November India Sierra navigate was the final point before transitioning into the procedural VOR approach, so they likely would have selected this as well. Now, when we're using the FMC programmed arrivals and approaches, the Compact Display Unit, or CDU, also shows any relevant speeds and altitude constraints coded into those procedures. For example, in this case, the requirement was to be at or above 4,300 feet until passing Ribar, Lamov, and a navigate called Juliet Sierra Tango. And once selected, this information would have also been visible on their navigation displays. Now, when everything was set up, the pilots also spent some time discussing potential threats for the approach, including the fact that the VOR glide path was steeper than usual, which might require them to configure early to get the speed down. And also the fact that this was a non-precision approach, which always requires higher concentration, diligence, and adherence to procedures. Now, including potential threats in the briefing is a relatively recent concept, because it's been found that by visualizing and coming up with strategies for dealing with anticipated threats, many errors can be avoided and crews become generally more resilient. This is similar to you planning for a busy traffic situation and therefore leaving your house earlier for work, but at a much bigger scale. Now, the VOR approach into runway 11 in this case also involved something known as a procedural turn, starting at November India Sierra VOR and then turning via Lamov to Ribar and to the final approach point at Juliet Sierra Tango. With the SOSEC 1 Romeo Alpha arrival, the crew would have had to fly this whole procedure, but there was actually a better arrival available for them, which would lead them in a straight line towards Ribar and Juliet Sierra Tango for a straight-in approach. This approach was called SOSEC 2 Alpha, but since the crew were unfamiliar with the airport, they just went with whatever was in their flight plan instead. Now, it is worth pointing out here that there was also a transition from the Juliet Sierra Tango and the B beacon on that arrival to allow entrance into the VOR approach from other directions as well, and that Juliet Sierra Tango transition will soon become important. But the crew likely didn't spend so much time looking at different arrivals because, like I mentioned before, there was also additional threats with this approach, including the fact that the approach was steeper than normal, but also that the inbound course on the approach was 115 degrees, but the runway direction was 109 degrees, meaning an offset by 6 degrees. That might not sound like a lot, but it would have meant that the runway would not be directly in front of them when they became visual, and they would therefore also require to do some late-stage maneuvering. So the pilots discussed how they intended to fly all of this, and would have covered elements like how and when they would slow down and configure the aircraft, if the weather was okay for the approach, and what they expected to see once visual. But that brings up the question, what was the weather like? Well, while the conditions on the ground was relatively good, with only light and variable winds, a QNH of 1013 and a temperature of 6 degrees Celsius, higher up the picture was slightly different. There were several layers of clouds at altitude, which would obscure the view of the terrain, so during the descent the crew would be flying almost entirely inside of cloud, preventing any visual orientation at all, and that's also worth keeping in mind. Anyway, the crew soon received clearance from the area controller to start the descent down towards the destination, and soon they also approached Sosek, which was the starting point for their arrival procedure. But when they were almost over that point, the controller suddenly called them up and cleared them to follow the Sosek 2 Alpha arrival instead of the Sosek 1 Romeo Alpha. Now, as I mentioned before, this was actually a better routing for them overall, but it was not the one that they had actually briefed. It isn't uncommon that there are several arrivals starting from the same point and going to the same runway. The reason for that is that the different ones can then be used depending on which nav aids are working or for traffic separation purposes, and if you find yourself having programmed and briefed one arrival and then you are suddenly cleared for another, you can always try to make your life easy by asking the controller if you can fly the one that you've planned for, and they might actually approve that. But if that's not possible, or like in this case it would mean a significantly longer routing, well then it's super important that the pilots enter the new arrival into the flight management computer, checks it thoroughly, and then brief it all over again, since both the routing and the altitude restrictions can be very different. But in this case, the crew seemed to be in a little bit of a hurry, so they just entered the new arrival into the FMC and executed it, without ever going through and briefing it properly. And that's even though they had plenty of time to do so at this point. Now, if they would have looked at it, they would have noticed that the Sosek 2 Alpha would, like I mentioned before, bring the aircraft in on a more direct routing via Ribar and then towards the Juliet Sierra Tango NDB for the approach. But do you remember the Juliet Sierra Tango transition that I talked about earlier? Well, this transition created a procedural turn from Juliet Sierra Tango via a point called NIS 308, Ribar, and then back to Juliet Sierra Tango. But from the direction that flight 801 was now coming, there was no reason to fly that. They were already coming from Ribar directly towards Juliet Sierra Tango and could therefore proceed straight in for the approach. But that procedure turn was still in there as an option, and when the pilots just quickly entered this new arrival, reselected the approach via Juliet Sierra Tango, and then executed, it stayed in there. If they would have selected the no via option instead, that would have solved the problem. Remember? Rubbish in, rubbish out. Now, the minimum altitude that all aircraft had to maintain until reaching Juliet Sierra Tango was 4,300 feet. This was true both from the direction of Ribar and for the procedure turn after Juliet Sierra Tango if coming from the other direction. The earliest time anyone could descend from 4,300 feet was after passing Juliet Sierra Tango and established on the 115-degree final inbound track towards the VOR. And that is going to be very important soon. The pilots continued to descend according to the minimum altitudes on the arrival, and after they passed the Ribar, they should have set 4,300 feet, which was the platform altitude for the VOR approach. But instead, the first officer now selected 1,000 feet in open descent, which caused the aircraft to start descending below the minimum altitude way too early. He didn't mention this mode change to the captain, which is a serious breach of procedures, especially when flying in mountainous terrain, but luckily the captain quite quickly realized this error and told him to immediately climb back up to 4,300 feet again. Now, we don't know why this mistake happened, but 1,000 feet was their minimum descent altitude on the VOR approach, rounded up from 970 feet, and it is possible that the first officer, being a little bit stressed about the coming steep offset approach, simply made a mistake here. And it wouldn't be the last one. This hiccup would have likely increased the workload for the first officer, since the real descent point, Juliet Sierra Tango, was less than 3 nautical miles away when this happened, and this might also have had an impact on what happened next. As the aircraft passed Juliet Sierra Tango, the first officer expected to now finally be able to start descending down towards the airport. There were a lot of other configurations that also needed to be made, and all of this would have formed part of the mental picture he now had for the approach ahead. But here, something completely baffling happened. The aircraft suddenly started turning left. Now, of course, it did so because of the route that was loaded into the flight management computer, but the first officer who was flying did not want that to happen. So he now pulled out the heading track button to take control over the direction manually and keep the aircraft continuing straight ahead. And he also quickly initiated a descent down towards 1,200 feet. The captain, who had caught the earlier altitude mistake the first officer had made, now told him to instead allow the aircraft to complete the full procedure turn. In his view, they had already deviated from the approach radial at this point, so he likely thought that, although annoying, a turn wouldn't be a disaster and they could just start the approach once they reached the NDB again after the turn. But somehow, he missed that the first officer had also started descending. Remember, the minimum altitude was 4,300 feet until passing the Juliet Sierra Tango NDB inbound on the approach, and that was for very good reasons. There were several high mountains in this area, including a peak of 3,152 feet quite close to the approach track. Now, instead of allowing the first officer, who was still pilot flying, to take care of the turn, the captain instead intervened and simply turned the heading bug around himself and then re-engaged the lateral navigation. And as he was doing that, the first officer was simultaneously reducing the descent rate from 1,100 feet per minute to 700. I would just like to point out here that it's never a good idea to have both pilots inputting on the flight controls or the mode control panel at any point. It's super important that we keep to our designated areas of responsibility in order to avoid confusion of who is in control. And this is especially true when the first officer is pilot flying, as the captain overriding can cause the first officer to completely lose initiative and situational awareness. So what was now happening was that the two pilots had two completely different views on how to solve their current situation. The captain wanted to complete the turn whilst maintaining 4,300 feet until over the Juliet Sierra Tango again, whilst the first officer had intended to just manually continue inbound and therefore started to descend. And the result was the worst possible combination of those two plans. At an altitude of only 2,200 feet, the aircraft was on a heading of 158 degrees to rejoin the track towards Juliet Sierra Tango, but that also meant that they now had a huge mountain towering 1,000 feet above and ahead of them. At this point, the captain must have suddenly realized that the aircraft wasn't maintaining its altitude, and he therefore called out, "Why are we descending?" whilst also telling the first officer to immediately go around and start turn left. But by this point, they had descended even further, down to 1,880 feet, and they were now so close to the mountain that the enhanced ground proximity warning system activated and started blaring out,
Terrain ahead. Pull up.
Now, when that warning is heard, there is a very clear procedure that must be followed immediately and without hesitation, and that's known as the terrain escape maneuver. In the Airbus, that maneuver includes turning the autopilot off, pitch, pull to full backstick, thrust levers full toga, speed brakes verified down, and bank wings level or adjust. It's super important that the pilot flying execute these items immediately from memory, and it's the job of the pilot monitoring to make sure that everything is done correctly, to monitor the aircraft's performance and to call out any tendencies towards terrain. But what instead happened here was that as the captain called for the first officer to go around and to climb, the first officer reacted by engaging the autopilot in full climb, even though the autopilot should be immediately disconnected in this case. And after that, both pilots started pulling back on their respective side sticks. But none of them moved the thrust levers into the toga detent, so the thrust just stayed in normal climb as instructed by the autopilot and the auto thrust. Again, following standard procedures and adhering to designated roles would have likely captured these mistakes, but a feeling of panic was now starting to spread, and with that, the communication was also breaking down even further, meaning that the thrust was left unchanged. Now, when two pilots pull back on their side sticks at the same time without anyone taking priority, the Airbus's fly-by-wire system will take both of those inputs into account. In this case, this meant that the nose of the aircraft rapidly rose to a pitch up of almost 21 degrees. And what happens if the nose attitude is suddenly increased without full thrust selected? Yes, the speed now started washing off at the same time as the angle of attack also started rising. Now, remember how I mentioned the American Airlines Cali accident earlier on and how they had been tricked to fly towards a mountain due to a mistake they had made in their FMC? Well, that's very similar to what had happened here, and now the similarities became almost eerie as this crew also initially mishandled the terrain escape maneuver. But this is where decades of technical advancements finally came to the pilot's aid. Because not only did this crew get their terrain warning significantly earlier than the crew of American Airlines Flight 965, they also had the awesome protections of the Airbus A320 at their disposal. You see, the Airbus contains numerous protections known as hard protections, and those are non-overridable actions taken by the out-of-flight system to keep the aircraft within a safe flight envelope, and they are available as long as the aircraft is operating in normal law. One of these protections is known as alpha floor, and it kicks in when the speed of the aircraft starts to fall below the minimum selectable airspeed together with a high angle of attack. All of this was happening in this case due to the extremely high pitch angle combined with a turn away from the terrain and a dropping airspeed. When this is sensed, one of the things that happens is that it causes an auto-engagement of maximum toga thrust, and it then locks that thrust in using something known as toga lock. This function will, as the name suggests, keep the thrust output in toga until the crew unlocks it by disengaging the auto throttle. So as these pilots were now pitching up and turning with the speed dropping, the aircraft itself actually gave them full thrust, despite them not initially setting it. Now they did eventually move the thrust levels into the toga detent, but at that stage, toga lock had already engaged and it would have been visible on their FMAs in their primary flight displays. And as we will see, this was soon going to give them a whole new problem. You see, having gone from a potential controlled flight into terrain event, where aside from a loss of situational awareness, the pilot had at least been in control of the aircraft, they now started to really fall behind the airplane, which essentially meant that instead of them flying the airplane was now flying them. Throughout this whole ordeal, the crew had not been in contact with the NIS approach controller. The last time that he had heard anything from them was when they read back their approach clearance. But now they called him up again, explaining that they had gone around. The controller responded and asked the crew to maintain the go-around altitude of 4,300 feet, but at this stage that altitude was already well below them. Now they overshot that missed approach altitude, likely because of a combination of their very low weight and the fact that they were prioritizing the terrain escape maneuver, which I completely understand. But once they felt sure that the terrain was no longer a factor, the first officer started to lower the nose to try and level off. And what do you think happened then? Yes, since the auto throttle was still in toga lock, it didn't matter that the crew pulled the thrust levels back, the engines would just keep producing maximum thrust until the pilots fully disengaged the auto thrust. And an interesting tidbit here is that toga lock actually would disengage on other Airbus types, but not on the Airbus A320. Anyway, this high thrust now caused the light aircraft to quickly accelerate, and it soon reached an astonishing speed of 331 knots, only 19 knots away from the maximum certified speed of the aircraft. At around 6,500 feet, the pilots finally managed to disengage the auto thrust and get the speed back under control, and around 30 seconds later, they also managed to level off, reaching a maximum altitude of 7,640 feet. 3,340 feet above the cleared altitude and 81 knots faster than the highest speed allowed in this airspace. Fortunately though, there were no other aircraft in the airspace, so it didn't lead to any traffic conflict. But this is a great example of how quickly things can start to get out of hand when one mistake leads to another and strict cockpit discipline is not adhered to. On a private note, I also think at this point, yet again, to the problems with Airbus's idea of not having active side sticks and self-moving thrust levels to give tactile indications of what's happening to the pilots. In this case, again, both pilots were inputting on the controls at the same time, and even though toga lock was enunciated on their flight mode annunciator, it took a long while for the pilots to actually realize it. Something that would have been obvious if the thrust lever actually showed what the thrust was doing. On the other hand, the fantastic alpha floor protection and toga lock probably saved their bacon during the escape maneuver, so I will still lodge this as a win for the Airbus safety systems. Whilst the situation had calmed down a bit, the pilots rejoined the published missed approach procedure and descended back to 4,300 feet. After this, another procedural approach was flown, this time to a successful landing without any further incidents, but I'm guessing that the poor cabin crew on the jump seat probably had a few more grey hairs and also a few stories to tell her colleagues after this. Now, the crew obviously reported this, but it took a few days for the authorities to realize just how serious of an incident this actually was. At that point, the cockpit voice recorder had already been lost, so this story is based on the flight data recordings, interviews and other retrievable data. The investigation found that the incident was caused by the incorrectly executed re-cleared arrival route, which had not been properly briefed by the pilots. This then led them to descend at the wrong point, directly towards terrain, which was followed by an incorrectly executed terrain escape maneuver and subsequent level and speed busts. The root cause for all of this was inadequate communication and work distribution between the pilots, which led to a loss of situational awareness as the emergency escalated. And on top of that, the pilots were not always aware of what the automatics were doing, and all of this was made worse by the weather, the low weight of the aircraft, and possibly also by some distractions caused by having another person in the cockpit. But what I think was left out here was the obvious onset of something known as the startle effect. That's what happens when something genuinely unexpected happens, which quickly raises the stress level and often leads to a few seconds of surprise inaction before we start doing something. And when we do, it's super important that we follow trained procedures, because if not, mistakes like this can easily happen. Now, it's super hard to train startle response, especially in the simulator, since it often becomes very obvious that we are setting a crew up for a terrain escape maneuver, for example. And therefore, real startle is often experienced for the first time in an actual, real situation. That's why diligent training of procedures, high technical knowledge and strict cockpit discipline is so important. Now, Wizz Air took this incident seriously and reviewed their training syllabus regarding terrain escape maneuvers, non-precision approaches and adherence to cockpit areas of responsibilities. Information about this event was then sent out to all pilots in the company to make sure that everyone can learn from it, and the involved pilots received some extra training and was then allowed back on the line again. And this is exactly how this industry stays as safe as it is. You see, mistakes will happen. We're all human, but as long as there is honesty and transparency, it shouldn't lead to disciplinary procedures. Instead, we can all learn from it and hopefully avoid similar mistakes in the future. Now, this video was made possible by my fabulous team and the support we are all getting from the members of my Patreon crew. If you want to see these videos early and help produce them, then join my crew by going to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot or click on the link in the description below. Have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.